What really happened with your host, Mike Rivero. You're listening to the Republic Broadcasting Network, where you'll find out what the Fukushima's going on.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show today. It's Friday, December 28th, 2018, almost to the end of the month, almost to the end of the year here. And thank goodness it's Friday. That's all I can say here. It's been a heck of a month, a heck of a year. And we've got a lot to talk about today. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. That's 800-313-9443. Mike is in our control room, ready to answer the phone, put you in the air with your comments, questions, and opinions. And yes, the lovely Lady Claire will be joining us in hour number 3. And hour number 3, we're going to really kind of put over to looking back on 2018, the good, the bad, the ugly, and our prognostications for 2019, and our New Year's resolutions. And obviously be a good time for you to call on in with your New Year's resolutions and what it is that you're hoping or dreading for 2019. And the reason for that is this is our last show of 2018. Republic Broadcasting is giving our much overworked staff off both Monday and Tuesday. So the next time we'll be live on air will be Wednesday, January 2nd, 2019. So this is the last show, last live show of the year of 2018. So kick back and enjoy it. And also, we've just now crossed the deadline for bids for Sears. And unless a bid has come on in to buy the chain, it will go directly into liquidation. So far, I'm not hearing that anything has really come on in to help keep the Sears name alive. Somebody wrote me an email the other day saying, I don't know if you've noticed, but every time I'm in the store and past the magazine rack, I see the same face staring back at me, always Michelle Obama on the cover of different magazines. This has been going on for literally months now and is carried over the holiday season. Yeah, it's a PR campaign. And I've noticed it too, and there was actually a news story on Fox earlier today about how Michelle Obama is now more popular than Hillary Clinton, which is really not saying much. Hillary Clinton's popularity is in free fall, and I think at this point even Rasputin is more popular than Hillary Clinton. But it looks to me like, yeah, Michelle Obama is thinking about tossing her hat into the ring in 2020. Which I think would be an epic fail. Not because she's black, not because she's a woman, but because she doesn't really bring anything to the job. At least with Hillary Clinton, she had been a lawyer and very active in politics. She had the experience of being Secretary of State, even though she corrupted that office thoroughly. Michelle Obama is just, for all intents and purposes, she's a person off the street. Her only claim to political popularity is that she's the wife of a president. And I don't want the wife of a president being in the Oval Office based solely on that qualification any more than I want the wife of a doctor operating on me or the wife of the pilot flying the airplane I'm riding in today. So you can see where I'm coming from that. All right, getting on into the news. Over in Syria, the YPG, which is part of the Syrian Kurds, the YPG is the Kurdish People's Protection Units, have released an official statement inviting the government of Damascus to assert control over the areas from which YPG units had allegedly withdrawn, in particular Manbij. Now, what really makes this kind of tricky is the U.S. forces are still occupying Manbij. So now we have the Syrian government forces and the U.S. forces in very, very close proximity. And how they're going to respond to that, we don't know. I imagine that Assad is going to have a cool head about that. And Trump, because supposedly we're withdrawing from Syria, is going to have a cool head about it. But there's always the possibility of some hothead making a stink there. The wild card, of course, are the Turkish armed forces that are continuing to mass at the Syrian border, and they have deployed at least 10 M60T battle tanks and several armored vehicles in the province of Kilis. So it does look like Erdogan, despite the warnings from the Russians, is planning on coming into Syria and going after the Kurds. Now that's going to put Assad in a very difficult place. Is he going to just kick back and allow Erdogan to violate his national sovereignty and get the Kurds, or is Assad going to commit the Syrian government forces to protecting the Kurds, even though the Kurds are political enemies who still want to break off part of Syria into an independent Kurdistan? So that's going to be very, very tricky for them. Now, over in Iraq, as you know, Trump did this surprise visit to the troops in Iraq to cheer them up, sign their Make America Great hats and their Trump 2020 patches, and basically cheer them up, which I think was a very nice thing for him to do. Let's be honest. That's definitely going to be a morale booster over there. But it didn't really please the government of Iraq, who apparently had not been informed it was going to happen. And they're saying that the surprise Trump visit violated their country's sovereignty, and they are reiterating their demand that the U.S. troops leave, because it's way past the end of the agreement they had for the extended stay of U.S. troops there, and the Iraq parliament is looking to pass a bill that will order the expulsion of U.S. forces. So that is going to be a very sticky situation. What are we going to do? Have a third war in Iraq? Just say, well, we're going to have war with Iraq because we've got a right to stay. No, you don't. It's their country. Okay. Now, a lot of people are still talking about Israel's recent airstrike into Syria, which involved the use of civilian flights as cover for their operations. And according to Peter Ford, the former British ambassador to Syria, this indicates the Israelis are changing tactics. And, of course, it's very dangerous for the Israeli F-16 jets to use two commercial aircraft as cover. Now, these aircraft were trying to land in Damascus and Beirut, respectively, and the Israeli planes basically flew in their radar shadow. And Beirut is complaining, Damascus is complaining. You're not supposed to put civilian people in jeopardy when you're carrying out a war operation, but Israel clearly did. Now, Israel has released satellite photos showing a 900 square meter area where they're claiming they destroyed an Iranian arms depot. And I'm suspicious of the photos because they're in black and white, and all the satellites up there these days shoot in color, and it's your typical propaganda photo. It's just a blank piece of dirt, and there's a little arrow in a box that says, here is where the Iranians were, and there's nothing in the image to indicate the Iranians were ever there. Meanwhile, Netanyahu is vowing to continue military operations in Syria to counter Iran's military presence. So, meanwhile, up in Afghanistan, the Pentagon has grudgingly acknowledged Iran's key role in restoring peace and stability to war-torn Afghanistan. And this is sort of a backtrack on Washington's earlier claims that Tehran supports the local Taliban militant group. And the U.S. Department of Defense sent a report to Congress saying Iran seeks a stable Afghan government that is responsive to Iranian goals, the elimination of ISIS-K, the removal of the U.S. NATO presence, and the protection of Iranian concerns such as water rights and border security, which makes perfect sense from the Iranian point of view. And the Pentagon also admitted Iran's influence in Afghanistan, saying that Tehran pursues a multi-track strategy of engaging with the Afghan government and boosting bilateral economic ties with Kabul, all of which sounds very peaceful and pleasant. Of course, that's not what the United States wants. The United States wants to maintain a junta in Kabul, and they want to continue the access to that pipeline right-of-way at below fair market cost, not to mention access to all that opium. Now, if the Taliban gets back into any kind of control in Afghanistan, you can kiss the opium goodbye, because the Taliban is absolutely intolerant of opium farming. When they were in charge of Afghanistan, they basically eliminated the opium trade. If you were caught with an opium poppy, they'd take your hand off. Draconian, but it worked. As soon as the U.S. invaded, somehow opium poppy seeds got flooded into Afghanistan. The poppies were blooming, the bumper crops were underway, and very inexpensive opium flooded into Russia and here in the United States, fueling the American drug lords and the pharmaceutical industry, which is now overprescribing opiates like crazy because addicted patients are reliable patients and a permanent source of cash flow. George Galloway is out there basically saying that the Islamic State is starting to set up shop in Ukraine, and he sees this as a Christmas gift from the West. And the report in the British newspaper The Times said Chechen Islamists who had come up from Syria and Iraq have arrived at the war front in eastern Ukraine. And apparently the Islamist Chechens were under the command of the fascist right sector and were there to fight Russians because we like fighting Russians and we will never stop fighting Russians. So it looks like the trouble spot has shifted from Syria only to go up to Ukraine to push that war with Russia here. This leads us to another article. This is out of Russia Today, talking about how Britain and the United States have been looking at jihadist groups as useful for several years now. And it begs the question, is Great Britain and the United States really as against terrorists as they pretend to be? And the answer obviously is no. At the same time, we were getting propagandized by the corporate media about, oh, ISIS, they're beheading foam rubber dummies and they're doing all sorts of terrible things. They're dancing barefoot on shag carpeting and, refusing to brush their teeth. We then find out that the U.S. was covertly arming, training, and supplying ISIS as a proxy against Bashar al-Assad. And so all of these ISIS terrorists that we've been told to fear, they've all been trained up by the United States government. A lot of duplicitousness out there in the world. Over in Germany, they are dealing with a personnel shortfall, and apparently it is so bad that the German defense chief is now suggesting recruiting people from other EU nations to the ranks of the Bundeswehr. And that may prove tricky because those other EU nations have their own military that they're trying to recruit into. But Berlin is trying to put its troubled armed forces back on their feet, and the German Chief of Defense, Eberhard Zorn, has devised this unconventional way to deal with at least one of his problems, the personnel shortage. Well, heck, Eberhard, you've got a country full of refugees there. I'm sure they came to Germany because they love Germany and they would just jump at the chance to serve in the military and prove their patriotism to their new home. In a pig's eye. Okay, the Yellow Vest protests in France are planned to continue for tomorrow and will run into the new year. They're going to be holding them tomorrow and New Year's Eve and continue into 2019. And Letitia Diwala, who's a spokeswoman for the protest movement, says the Yellow Vests are still mobilized. They do not have a traditional leadership structure, which is going to make it very, very difficult, if not impossible, for France to really put the movement down. When you have a movement like the Yellow Vests or like Occupy Wall Street, if you have a leadership structure, they're the target. And the movement can be destroyed by destroying that target. If you are part of a leaderless resistance, it's all but impossible to stop it. Now, another representative of the Yellow Vest, Benjamin Kaonohi, warned that if the concessions made so far by Macron did not add up, there will be a large-scale mobilization in late January. And I did tell you, once we're into the new year, once we're out of all this holiday nonsense, this thing is going to crank up. On Thursday, Funk Media Group in Germany published an interview with the EU Budget Commissioner and former Prime Minister of Baden-Württemberg, Günther Oettinger. And he basically came on out saying that in giving in to the demands of the Yellow Vest protesters, Macron has lost authority. Now, that is an interesting statement, because what he is saying is that Macron's authority rests on defying the will of the French people. And yet France supposedly is a republic with a democratically elected government. And in a democracy, the government is supposed to serve the needs and desires of the people. Macron's authority rests on the approval of the people, of the French voters. So we're starting to see, again, that ugly conflict coming up between nationalists, populists, and the authoritarian globalists. Because that's what the New World Order is. It's going to be a dictatorship, an intense dictatorship. There'll be no democracy, there'll be no dissent, there'll be no rights. There will be the global government saying, you will do this. Down in Israel, everybody's sort of gearing up for the elections next year, and a former Israeli Armed Forces chief, Benny Gantz, has started a new political party, the Israel Resilience Party, and right now in the polls, he is very close to Netanyahu. Now, Gantz and his IRP party are talking about preserving Israel as a Jewish and democratic country. And they're also pledging unspecified changes to priorities in national security and the economy, from which I would say he's probably as much a hardliner as Netanyahu himself. As we look back over the year of 2018, Israeli occupation forces and settlers have killed 295 Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza this last year. 14 Israelis were killed by Palestinians during the same period, in addition to a baby who died days after his premature birth, following the shooting and critical injury of his mother. More than 29,000 Palestinians were injured during 2018, the highest number of injuries in a single year since the U.S. Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs began collecting data in 2005. Nearly 60 of those Palestinian kills and 7,000 of those injured were children. Yesterday we reported on how Saudi Arabia's King Solomon has had a major reshuffle of the upper levels of his government, of all of the top officials. And they're saying it's basically to make the cabinet more efficient and loyal to the king and the crown prince in the face of U.S. pressure. Others are saying this may be a signal that Saudi Arabia is more open to cooperation with the West, perhaps about the Khashoggi matter. We got to take a break for commercials, and we'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. Turning to our local domestic politics here. Score another victory for Judicial Watch. They're doing fabulous fabulous work. They have just released 2 sets of heavily redacted State Department documents, 38 pages and 48 pages, showing that the Obama State Department provided classified Russiagate documents to multiple senators immediately ahead of the Trump inauguration. So this bolsters the case that there was a serious plan to just push this whole Russia influencing the election as a means to legally challenge the election and get Trump out of the White House and put Hillary in. They were actually seriously thinking of trying to do that. And I think that would have definitely triggered major civil unrest in this country. And apparently the documents were sent to Senator Mark Warner, Senator Ben Cardin, and Senator Robert Corker. And once again, Judicial Watch obtained these documents, which are supposed to be public records. They had to file a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit. Now, here's a very, very bizarre story. As you know, the Robert Mueller investigation filed a lawsuit against this Russian company. And apparently the expectation was the Russian company was just going to ignore it for lack of jurisdiction. And then, much to Mueller's surprise, the Russian company sent lawyers into court to defend themselves. And now they're in the discovery phase, and they're trying to get, as they have a right to, whatever Mueller has that indicates they might be guilty of something. And the Mueller investigation is resisting, and they're going to the court and saying, no, the discovery would threaten national security. And the lawyers for the Russians are now ribbing Mueller because apparently one of the pieces of information Mueller connected regarding the Russian company was a nude selfie. And Eric Dubalier, who's an attorney for Concord Management and Consulting, is accusing Mueller's team of illegally keeping information from the company and asks, is a nude selfie really threatening the national security of the United States? So, again, it was a witch hunt, and Mueller was trying to charge people at that time to make himself look like he was on the trail of something legitimate. And he wasn't. It's a big nothing burger. A big, long, costly, taxpayer-funded nothing burger. And if Mueller and the Democrats have their way, they're going to keep this thing going all the way up to 2020. Because if you look at it, I mean, they're already campaigning. We just got out of the 2018 midterms, and already the news is being dominated by, who are the hopefuls for 2020? At this point, who cares? I'm really sorry, but I'm burned out on nonstop politics. There are other things that need to be done by the government, like fix the roads, fix the bridges, fix the rail system. Or maybe we should be grateful. I mean, if they're spending all their time in their faction wars back and forth fighting with each other, it's the less harm they can do to the rest of the country. Now, the other day we were talking about this billionaire who funded a campaign that set up a bunch of phony Russian accounts to convince voters in Alabama that candidate Roy Moore was being supported by the Kremlin. He's a Russian stooge. How could you possibly vote for him? And he did lose the election. Now, this has caught the attention of Alabama's Attorney General. And he is starting to look at collecting information about this project, which was called Project Birmingham. And he says it does look like it did affect Moore's tight race against Doug Jones, who was the Democrat who ultimately won. And so Steve Marshall, who's the Attorney General, is saying they're going to look into it. There may be a serious violation there. Yeah, of course it's a violation. It's a dirty trick. And we should be intolerant of those. I mean, it's almost Nixon-esque, if you will, in what they did to this guy. And yes, politics is a dirty business. We don't need any ghosts come from the grave to tell us that. But I don't think we should just sit and say, okay, this is the way it is, and we're comfortable with it. Because they're not just cheating the candidates, they're cheating us, the voters. They're tricking us. They're swindling us as well. We're going to take another break for commercials. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here now over at 12160.info. They have an article which really kind of lays out the selectivity, if you will, of the Mueller investigation. Because Brennan, Comey, Clapper, and Rice were all caught lying. And nothing happened. No perjury charges, no demotions, no firings. Well, Comey got fired. Tucker Carlson had a report on Fox News just laying it on out. They're just so after Trump, and they're willing to look the other way for everybody who's lying to push that agenda. In fact, Fox News just ran a story about even before they take control of the House of Representatives, Democrats are already hiring lawyers to go after Donald Trump. And I actually feel sorry for Trump. The Democratic House is going to make his life a living heck for the next 2 years. And he hasn't done anything to deserve it other than be a Republican and a nationalist and wanting to put America first and wanting to secure that border. Now, here's a little bit of good news for those of you who have been following the case of Mumia Abu-Jamal. And for those of you who don't know who he is a former Black Panther who was convicted of killing a city police officer more than 30 years ago in a highly questionable jury trial. In fact, the trial was so flawed that the initial death sentence in 1982 was dropped and converted to a sentence of life in prison. Well, finally, a Philadelphia judge has reinstated appeal rights. And lawyers for Abu Jamal praised the decision by Philadelphia Common Pleas Judge Leon Tucker as a major step toward winning Abu Jamal's freedom. Now, I remember going back and studying that case and realizing that if I had been on that jury, I would have said, there's a reasonable doubt. I cannot in good conscience convict this guy. There are too many holes in the story. And there are indications that somebody else had actually killed the police officer. But back then it was, he's a Black Panther, and they're all violent, and they're militant, and they're dangerous, which, by the way, is not how the Black Panthers started out. They started out as an advocacy group, and they wanted things like guaranteed breakfasts for ghetto children, which sounds like a good idea to me. You can't study hard in school if you don't have a brain full of sugars and carbohydrates and proteins and stuff. They also wanted local control of the school curriculum, which even back then, we're talking 40 years ago, was already a hot button issue, as the federal government was trying to basically usurp control of school curriculum from the communities, the school districts, and the states. Say you will have one curriculum that we will decide on. Now, to me, it makes sense that local communities should have a say in the curriculum of their schools. Okay, if you're in farming country, it doesn't really make a lot of sense for the local schools to be teaching, well, for example, women's studies. And if you're in the Rust Belt, don't you want the schools teaching your kids more about manufacturing or auto, how to build an automobile? All right, we have a phone call here. Dustin in New Jersey, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yeah, Mike, I feel sorry for Nancy Pelosi. Like, the shutdown was just too much for her. She had to go to Hawaii. She's over by you.
Here?
Did she visit you
that
yet?
does it. We're getting on an airplane this afternoon.
And Maxine Waters was hard for her. She's in the Bahamas.
Yeah, and Trump canceled his trip to Florida.
Isn't it amazing, though? They shut down the government. Oh, the government's got to stay open. And they're already on the plane. They probably were telling people this on the cell phone on the plane. You know, they're frauds.
Well,
frauds.
Pelosi's here in Hawaii. All of a sudden, I don't feel so bad about all the thunderstorms we've got supposedly coming in for the rest of the day. You know, go lightning! Go lightning!
Keep her away from volcanoes.
Well, that's down on the Big Island.
Yeah. Hey, Mike, you were talking about France. Did you talk about France yet? How the EU gave them the okay to go over their budget now or something? It's like a one-time thing.
I thought Macron had already said he wasn't going to revisit that.
Yeah, because I just don't see where they're going to get the money from to give people an extra $100 a month, and that they just don't have the money. And people don't realize the EU's being held up by Germany. If France or Germany goes, that's it.
Yes.
There's nothing else.
There absolutely is. But, you know, this whole past year, there have been a lot of places that tried this idea of a universal basic income, and it doesn't work because they run out of money. They can't create the money out of thin air. They run out of money, and it does not work. You need to create a climate where people can trade their labors and their skills for decent wages and salaries, and they'll pump it into the bottom of the economy and get it going again. And why all of these governments involved in this New World Order globalism, or even just in Washington, D.C. and Wall Street, they seem to have forgotten that. And they're looking for a magic bullet of some kind that is going to undo all the financial damage done by corruption and incompetence over the last 30 years. It's just not out there. You have to go back to what actually worked, which is, again, a good consumer economy, high-paying jobs, and a tightly regulated banking sector.
But the problem is their whole structure is not built on that anymore.
No, it isn't. It's built on corruption. Our government is acting like an organized crime gang. It's like the mafia.
Hey, Mike, you were talking about beer, like the GMO. Probably 99% of American beer is GMO in it, but pretty much all of European beer is not, because they don't allow GMOs in there so far, right?
Oh, they've got very, very strict regulations regarding their beer. And when I worked in Germany, I had some German beer, and it spoiled me forever for American beer, which is just full of all kinds of chemicals and stuff. The origin of the Oktoberfest is because German beers are not allowed to have preservatives in them. They would get to October, and they would have a huge stockpile of beer, overproduction, and they would just give it away. And that's the origin of Oktoberfest. Of course, they don't give it away for free now, but it's definitely sold at a discount.
And then real quick, Mike, I just want to let you know, like, with that Russian Avangard missile,
yes,
if it does, like, up to Mach 20, which is 19,000 something miles an hour, that's like, I think they said 4 miles a second that thing does. That's insane.
Well, the Russians are saying it can actually hit Mach 27, which is above orbital speed.
Now, Mike, real quick again, like that Avangard, that doesn't go up into the atmosphere, right? It skims in between the atmosphere, right? And that layer in between, I believe, right?
Well, to an extent, it's launched up on an ICBM, and basically the Avangard replaces what would be the conventional MIRVing reentry warhead system. But the ballistic missile launches it up to the edge of the atmosphere, and yeah, it skims along the atmosphere for a bit, and then it does a terminal dive straight down. And during that dive, it can maneuver. And it's able to detect radar signals that are aimed at it and skedaddle out of the way. This thing is going to be impossible to hit with the U.S. current ballistic missile defense, which was sort of assuming everybody would cooperate and send all the warheads our way on predictable ballistic inbound tracks.
So the way it looked is there's 3 avant-gardes inside that shell, and is that each one has a certain amount of warheads for each glide vehicle?
I would imagine that each avant-garde, now I don't know for a fact because I haven't looked at it enough, but I imagine each avant-garde is a single warhead, but it's probably a significantly powerful one. I was not aware that the ballistic missile carried 3 avant-gardes up into space, but it would make sense that they would want to do that.
Yeah, because I just thought it looked like 3 came out of that shell from the video, and I thought there was multiple warheads to be delivered by each glide vehicle to its target.
The glide vehicles are technically the warhead. They're just intelligent. Instead of that cone-shaped reentry vehicle, they have the avant-garde, which is powered for at least part of its flight, and is able to maneuver on its way down into terminal phase.
Isn't that insane what they can do, like in maybe another 20 years, which if we're here, yeah, like, I mean, it's amazing. But, all right, Mike, have a good show.
Yeah, it's amazing, and it's also very frightening. And again, it reminds me of this quote from George Bernard Shaw. He wrote a play called Man and Superman, and the third act, Don Juan in Hell, is often performed as a standalone piece. And as the name says, it's Don Juan, he's gone to hell, and he's talking with the devil about the state of mankind. And the devil has this one quote in there that says, "There's nothing in man's industry but his greed and his sloth. His heart is in his weapons." And it certainly is true. If you look at the quality of work on consumer products or factories, or the quality of service for the internet or anything, it's slapdash. But you go and you look at those weapons, and it's always the very finest they're able to do. Doesn't always work, as was the case with the F-35, but that's where everybody's heart is with. It's part of our makeup. It's part of our instincts. We all get a thrill when we're holding a gun or a sword or a spear or a bow and arrow. It just touches something inside. And I do think we need to acknowledge that and just say, I'm going to keep this under control. Okay, I like having these things. I am not going to use them. All right, let's take another phone call. Oh, the phone lines are loading up. Al in West Virginia, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Michael, you mentioned about Hillary being an attorney. I wanted to mention that, just to give you a heads up here on, I don't know if this is 100% correct or not, but from my research, Hillary was actually, and so was Michelle Obama, both of them was patent attorneys, which means the type of patent attorneys that the government takes patents, if it's too dangerous to put out in the open market and have an open patent, they keep them for themselves in the government. And that's how one time she was supposedly, from what I remember, this was years ago, from what I remember, she was reprimanded for trying to steal some patents from the government patent office. And I think that's how maybe some of that stuff actually got to China.
Now, I don't know about Michelle Obama. I know that a patent attorney is a subset of being an attorney, and I know that what Hillary Clinton was doing at the Rose Law Firm had nothing to do with patents. But there was some malfeasance at some point, and she was facing disbarment, and I believe she and Bill both voluntarily surrendered their law license rather than go through that process, and that's all I remember about that. But there's absolutely no question that Bill Clinton during his campaign for a second term in office, did authorize the transfer of highly sensitive technology, the sale of this technology to China over the objections of the Defense Department and the intelligence agencies, and Chinese money was funneled into his re-election campaign. But this was already finished technology ready to go, and there's something you need to understand about patents. In the early days, an inventor had to provide a physical model to the patent office that proved the invention he was describing would actually work. This being back in the days of mechanical devices. Then there was this tragic fire that destroyed the archive of the models, and I believe they actually still have the melted remains as an art piece in the lobby of the current patent office. And then they basically changed the laws to where you can patent any idea without proving that you're able to make it work. And that's where the patent trolls have come from, where they'll just think up all these ideas and they'll file for a patent, and then they'll wait for somebody to come up with something similar, and they'll pounce and sue and make a lot of money. And like so much else in our government, the patent office needs to be basically overhauled back to its original purpose, which was to protect actual inventors and actual inventions financially for a limited amount of time, after which the patented invention would pass over into the public domain for the benefit of the general population.
From what I understand, that whenever you go into the presidential area of government, that you have to surrender your attorney license.
I've never heard that before.
No ifs, ands, or buts.
I've never heard that before.
Oh, well, okay, maybe looked it up, but yeah. But I'm pretty sure that's the way it is. I studied law for 28 years, but I'm pretty sure that's where it is. I don't remember exactly where it was at. I read it, but I do remember reading it. But anyhow, I just wanted to bring that up about the she was mostly a patent attorney, and supposedly Michelle was too. So that was kind of a connection there between the both of them, the both families there. So I'll let you go. Thank you very much.
Thanks an awful lot here. We're going to let you go, and I know we've got other callers coming up on the line, but we're just about at a commercial break. But I do have enough time to share this story with you. The Clintons are continuing their speaking tour, and it's not going very well. They were up at the Scotiabank Arena in Toronto, which holds 19,800 people, and 83% of the seats were empty. So take a hint, Hillary. We got to take another break for commercials. We'll be back with more phone calls after these few words. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here, and we're going to go back to the phones to Wayne in West Virginia. Wayne, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Well, thank you. What was on my mind, I just wanted to pass on to you. When we look at the Middle East over there, and we look at Israel and what they're doing to the Palestinians, and I'm not defending anyone, isn't that about the same thing we did to the Indians?
Yes, a lot of people have brought that up, and I think, had we all been alive back then, I'm sure we would have joined with that part of America that really did think that what was being done to the Indians was atrocious, like Wounded Knee or the massacre at Sand Creek. But that was then, before we were alive, and I refused to take responsibility for anything that happened before I was born and was able to have any kind of influence on events. What's going on in the Middle East right here, right now, is something before us, and we do have the ability and the moral obligation to try and do something about it.
Yeah, but the bottom line is we're financing it.
Yeah, well, not voluntarily.
But, and isn't the same thing being done to the white race with what they're doing with the migration and all, cleansing the white race? And looking at that perspective, people say, well, they're not killing anybody. Well, yes, they are.
Yeah,
they use,
people are
the
being
smoke
killed,
and the smoke.
and mostly I'm more concerned about the anti-white rhetoric that we're starting to hear, not just from the refugees and the illegal immigrants, but even from liberals who are out there saying that all the problems in the world are the fault of us white, male, heterosexuals. And then you realize what a short step that is from that kind of rhetoric to what we're currently seeing down in South Africa, where white people are just being killed and tortured, and it's become socially acceptable.
Or being slaughtered. Well, if you ever read the book Hellstorm, I think Hellstorm is coming this way. And I think we're in for a big surprise. Unfortunately, when you tell the average American, white American, the truth, they don't want to hear it. And then they get mad at you when you tell them the truth. So,
well, that's because the lies are so comfortable. The government and the corporate media have spun a very comfortable lie about America's greatness and how life is better here than it could be anywhere else, and we're exceptional people. And there's still a small and dwindling segment of the American public that wants to believe that because they are flat out afraid of facing up to what's going on in this country. And so they're going down the same route as the so-called good Germans, who refused to look at what the Nazis were doing to Germany leading up to and during World War II. And as a result, they lost pretty much everything, including their country. Okay, so Wayne, I got to let you go. We got to do station identification, top of the hour, and we'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show, hour number 2. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, and they're loaded up. Let's go to Philip in Virginia. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind? Hello. We lost Philip. All right, let's switch over to Jim in New York. Aloha, Jim. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yes, sir.
You're on the air.
Oh, I'm sorry, sir. I heard you a number of times talking about you went to Deutschland for the Christkindl market.
Yes.
And you enjoyed in the spirit of Christmas.
Yes.
Was that a beautiful experience for you?
It was. It really was.
And just out of curiosity, which cities did you go to?
I was working in Munich.
Houston?
Yeah, and I got to enjoy Christmas at the Marienplatz.
Oh, yeah. You should have done is gone down to Austria, where they really celebrate this. And I had the opportunity to do a Christmas market tour. And I have to be honest with you, sir, if you have the opportunity, take your wife over there. It's a beautiful thing. Just, do a Christmas tour. It's gorgeous.
I can imagine.
And, you start up north Rothenburg and wind up down in Salzburg. It's gorgeous. And, it's just funny when I hear you on the radio, I guess it was minimal with your experience there, but you felt something. Felt something wonderful. It was something that was in your soul. And I have to say, I don't think you're an atheist. I think you're an agnostic. If you can,
well, I'm a tolerant, understanding atheist, and by that I mean I have an issue with all these atheists who go on out and scream and yell about other people's religious decorations, and frankly, I think it shows they're actually insecure in their atheism. And so they have to project it onto other people in order to reassure themselves that what they have concluded is correct. And me, I really don't care. And it's one of the reasons why Claire and I get along so good, and I help her out with her choir. And, we had to do the Christmas thing at her church over the last weekend. I'm not going to force my lack of religion down anybody's throat. At the same time, I don't want them trying to force their religion down my throat. and live and let live, and we'll all get along just fine. But unfortunately, when I was in Germany, this was back in 1986, and it may have changed by now, I got to do the Christmas market virtually every single day, because the path from where my hotel was to the studio where I was working went right through the middle of the Marienplatz. And so every day after work, having nothing better to do, I would just stop and go through the market. And I brought back a lot of presents for people from there, and it was a wonderful feeling. And you don't see that kind of feeling and spirit here in the United States.
Was that spiritual?
Say again?
Was that spiritual?
Yeah, there was not spiritual so much as a Christmas spirit. People were handing out small goodies to total strangers, and it really was a time of good cheer. It felt very much like the Christmas that you thought it should be, reading the books of Charles Dickens, or seeing The Prince by Currier and Ives, or the paintings of Norman Rockwell. They captured that, and maybe that's because...
What's wrong with that?
There's nothing wrong with that. I absolutely loved it. I miss it.
Yeah, I have to be honest with you. Claire would you'd probably wind up halfway through the tour holding hands together saying, "This is beautiful."
We hold hands an awful lot. We'd be holding hands right from the beginning. We hold hands at the Safeway. We hold hands at the City Mill. We hold hands. Yeah, we hold hands a lot. It used to be because of love. Today, it's more a case of keeping each other from stumbling and falling down.
Oh, Jesus. No, but like I said, sir, I heard you making reference to it a number of times. I was like, he did experience that,
It was a good time.
Other side
it was very, very magic. I had some wonderful experiences there. Again, involving people I did not know, total strangers. I still have some of the gifts that were given to me back then. Hand-painted glassware, a beer stein. I've got my traditional German beer stein. Anyway, listen, Jim, we're going to let you go because I got to do a shout-out now. Real quick.
I'm really quick about a beer stein. You know why you have a beer stein? You know why I have the lid on it? To keep the flies out.
I thought it was to keep the thatch from falling in. The beer stein with the cover dates back to when you had thatched roofs, and there was always, straw drifting down.
No. It's just you don't want to be downing a fly or a bee in your beer.
Well, definitely not a bee, but as far as the fly is concerned, who cares? They're not going to drink all that much.
All right, sir.
All right, thanks an awful lot. What?
Christmas tour. Take her on a Christmas tour. She'll love it.
Well, this year's the year we're really going to try and get the money to get back to the mainland before we have a nuclear bomb go off over Pearl Harbor. And so we don't take vacations. We just don't have the means to do that. So anyway, thank you for the phone call.
It sounds like she's a hopeless romantic, and so are you, sir.
Well, lucky for me that she is. Anyway, Jim, gotta let you go. We got to do a shout out to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining the show, and we're going to switch over to Dave in Delaware. Aloha, Dave. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike, how you doing?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
I'm great. I heard a last caller. He was talking about how where all this anti-white propaganda comes from, and I just didn't know if you knew who was behind the open borders and the Calgary Plan and all that stuff. I wanted to talk to you about how you will never mention the Jew. When you talk about all these
Well,
crazy
we talk about George Soros. We talk about George Soros.
Yeah, but George. I'm not saying George. You mentioned George Soros. I
Yes.
didn't say that. I'm talking about HIAS, the Hebrew Israeli Aid Service. Right?
Aiea, the Israeli aides, they're the ones that are bringing all these migrants into these countries overseas. They're bringing them into Europe, and they're trying to bring them into our country now. So I don't understand how you will never really speak about that, And then, supposedly Trump, he's going to pull our troops out of Syria. I don't know. Did he really even do that? I don't know. Why were we in Syria to begin with? There's a bunch of different little topics that I'd like to speak to you about, Mike, but you always seem like you want to shut down conversations. Last time I called in, you kind of cut me off. So,
well, we were in Syria over an argument between Israel and Syria regarding an oil pipeline that Israel wanted to build so that they could send oil and gas from the Golan, which Syria still considers to be their territory, up to Europe. Well, that point is now moot because Israel's building the pipeline along the bottom of the Mediterranean. I think the U.S. government wanted to go into Syria and oust Bashar al-Assad and put in a puppet ruler as one more stepping stone on the way to Iran. You need to remember that wars are never started for just one reason. Same thing with assassinations. Usually you get a group of people who may have very different agendas, but all their agendas are solved by the same historic act, and that's when it happens.
But what about all the anti-white? What about all the anti-white propaganda that they're calling white men devils, and we're the evil scum of society? Don Lemon even said it. Who do you think that's coming off from? Like, where's that from?
It's coming from the globalists, and at the top of the peak of that whole information chain is George Soros and all the groups that he's funding.
Who are the globalists?
Well, the globalists are people like Angela Merkel and Tony Blair and everybody who has bought into this idea that there should be just one government. Hang on a second. There should be one government for the entire planet, and they all dream of polishing that golden throne of planet Earth with their own derriere somewhere down the road. And no doubt they have been richly...
What about Barbara Lerner Specter? What about Barbara Lerner Specter?
She's another one.
She said that Jews are going to be behind the whole, Europe's not going to be the monolithic societies they once were.
Okay, I mean, what's the point you're trying to make here? Because all I keep hearing you say is Jew, 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 and you're painting with too broad a brush for this program. This program is about talking about individuals.
I'm not trying to whitewash anything, Mike. I just feel like you always...
I didn't say whitewash. I said you're painting with too broad a brush. Okay? If you want to talk about individuals who are part of the globalist anti-white movement, you are free to be on this show. But if you're going to come into the show and say the Jew this and the Jew that, yeah, I'm going to cut you off again. That's not the way that we operate. Any more than we allow people to say the blacks this or the Hispanics this.
I didn't want you to cut me off in the first place, like you cut off the guy Tom from Florida the one time, and you used to also cut off what's his name from Barbados, John.
I never cut him off. He died.
Right now, Mike, listen to me. I didn't say you did. All you have now is the guy Dustin from New Jersey. He's from Ukraine. He's Jewish, and then you have the other guy from North Carolina.
Okay, what is your problem with Dustin being Jewish? Okay, my first wife was Jewish. Rivero is a Sephardic name.
Is he Jewish?
Okay, Dave,
he's Ukrainian Jew.
Dave,
I don't care.
Dave,
Mike.
listen to me.
Mike.
Listen to me or I'm dropping you. Okay, can you name an individual globalist or not?
Can I name an individual globalist or not?
Yes.
Yeah, Sharon Adelson. He's funded Trump's campaign. He's a billionaire. He's a Zionist
Absolutely.
Jew.
Absolutely. Largest donor to the Republican Party, and he wields tremendous influence over our government for an unelected individual.
Should I keep going?
Well, if you want to, but we're coming up on a commercial break.
Have you ever heard of David Ben Gurion?
Oh, yeah, of course, but he's not around anymore.
Oh, yeah, the New World Order, the Supreme Court of Mankind ran out of Jerusalem.
Well, there were a lot of people who were talking about that one, and I think one of the still unsettled issues for all the globalists is just where the global capital is going to be. And I know a lot of people in Israel want it to be in Jerusalem because it's a holy city. The United Nations wants it to be in New York. And who knows what George Soros absolutely wants. Anyway, listen, Dave, we're going to let you go here. Thank you very much for the phone call. We're going to let you go.
Thanks, Mike.
Good night. Have a happy new year. All right, getting on back to our local news here. It does seem like Alexandria occasionally has a cortex. Can't seem to go a day without just making a fool of herself. From equating the migrants at the border with Mexico with Jews escaping Nazi Germany, to trying to equate them with the baby Jesus in the manger. And now she put out a tweet showing the new plaque that is on her office door, because they're getting ready for the handover of Congress next week. And so she put out a Twitter with the photo of the plaque, which she captioned, "Don't be fooled by the plaques that we got. I'm still Alex from the Bronx," which, of course, is a takeoff on Jennifer Lopez lyrics from her song Jenny from the Block. And this, of course, resulted in another Twitter storm mocking her for that. Like, can you come up with something original? Or are you always going to be, riffing off of other people here? Okay. Apparently, the Senate security expert that had been working from Facebook has been suspended, and it seems to be a symptom of this whole Russiagate crumbling. Because as it turns out, there was a total of $4,700 spending on Google from Russian accounts influencing U.S. politics. That's not a huge amount. They didn't reach a lot of people. And a lot of those ads favored Hillary Clinton. And, of course, the corporate media just went to town saying, oh, the Russians rigged the election. They were influencing our election. Well, let's be dealing with real politics here, because every government on earth is always trying to influence every other government on earth to its own benefit. Look at what Israel does to the U.S. government as a good example of that. But in this case, the evidence is continuing to surface. There was a serious plan that was being considered to just blow up this Russiagate thing, create this whole idea that Russia somehow stole the election away from Hillary Clinton, leading to a legal challenge that would have taken Trump out of the White House and replaced him with Hillary Clinton. Now, I don't know at what point it was called off, but somebody probably said this is going to be very dangerous. It could result in civil unrest. And don't forget, there were already riots in the streets. The liberals were going nuts. They were trashing cities and cars and property all over the country, even in districts that had voted for Hillary Clinton. All right, let's take another phone call. Mark in North Carolina. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike, I'm sorry. I thought he was asking me if I was responding to something Mark in North Carolina said. This is Frank in North Carolina. But real briefly, I told him I just wanted to respond to something the last caller said. The thing is, from my point of view, I'm just reporting that your next door Jew, they don't have to be actively involved in any of this, because the agenda goes on whether they're actively involved or not. They just have to be quiet and go along with it and not say anything about it.
Mark, okay.
Continues.
There's a rule. Frank. There's a rule on this show, and I've said it many times before. We will talk about individuals who are doing bad or good things. I do not allow people to come on the show and paint with a broad brush and talk about the Jews or the blacks or the Hispanics as a whole group. Because within all of those groups, you're going to find people who are actually very, very nice. One of my very best friends in Hollywood was Jewish, Renee Valente, and she was a sweetheart. And she was not part of some evil cabal that was against white people. And so that's the rule here. If you have a complaint against an individual like George Soros or Sheldon Adelson, we'll talk. But don't come on in with this nonsense about how, all the Jews are involved. And I understand that Jewish people, hang on, they do tend to be very isolationist. They do look down on all other people, and that's built into their religion, even against other sects of Jews. And I learned this during my first marriage because my bride was Ashkenazi, and her family basically expressed a lot of hostility towards the Sephardics, of which my ancestry comes from that, and the Orthodox. But there tends to be a trace of xenophobia in all of us. And in some societies, it is looked down on and discouraged. Unfortunately, in other societies, it is fanned up and encouraged.
I never had any until I woke up about 9/11. But let me ask you, your friend in Hollywood, the lady, did she see you as a white man?
It never came up in conversation. We were making a TV movie.
She would be friendly. She wouldn't be friendly towards me as a white man.
Well, I back then I thought of myself as white. I still think of myself as white. Anyway, Frank, we got to let you go. We got to take a commercial break. We'll be right back. Aloha America, welcome back to this show here, and we're going to take another phone call from Al in Canada. Aloha, Al. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike. I hope you're doing well.
I'm doing fine, considering it's a Friday, and I got a 4-day weekend coming up.
Perfect. So, I just got getting home from work, and I kind of chimed in at the end of what Dave was talking about with you. Hate doesn't do anybody any good.
Nope.
I sent you a link to a YouTube video. It's a conversation with Jordan Peterson. He's a university professor up here in Canada.
I was just looking at it.
Yeah. So I've watched that. And basically, he says, in that bell curve of IQ, basically Jews are kind of at the higher end of the center. That's basically why they're
so are the Chinese. That's the ugly reality. I mean, I know it's not politically correct to say that different groups of people have different IQ, but it is a reality. And I remember many, many years ago when I was still a member of Mensa, this got talked about a lot. That we were living in a society that was working to try and make us ashamed of the fact that we did have a few more marbles than the people walking around us. And today it's politically incorrect to point out where one person might be smarter or more intelligent than the other. In fact, we're even seeing it in the schools where they're not even doing grades anymore because they want everybody to feel good and nobody to feel discriminated against. And they're taking out the incentive for achievement in our educational system. But it is just like the reality that there are people who are simply more physically attractive, and they're literally trying to demonize that as well. That we're not supposed to look at beautiful people and admire them for being beautiful people. That we should instead look at everybody equally. That's not human nature. And that's where liberalism really fails. They actually believe, because of Margaret Mead and coming of age in Samoa, they believe they can change human nature, and every time they try to do that, they fall on their faces.
Yeah, and it's happening right now up in this country, specifically with the federal government. I'm a Darwinian. I believe that we were here because we survived, and the only reason why we survived is because certain offshoots of our genetic past were stronger than others. And I mean, there's nothing to be ashamed in saying that. I don't feel ashamed. I don't feel ashamed to say that the Chinese and the Jewish people have a higher IQ than most of the people on this planet. Yep. I think it's a fact.
It is a fact. It's a demonstrated fact. And I remember here in this country when it was coming on out that a certain segment of the population wasn't doing as well on IQ tests. And the liberals came on out and said, well, the IQ tests are culturally biased and they need to be rewritten so that this designated group can do better than others, which sort of invalidates the whole point of having an IQ test to begin with.
Yeah. And, all it is just, just measuring someone's IQ. It has nothing to do with their drive. It has nothing to do with luck. There's a lot of other factors that are involved when a person is considered to be, what would be the word I'm looking for? I'm still thinking about Jordan Peterson because there's something else I wanted to say. When you're good in your field or whatever, you're what's that word I'm looking for, Mike?
Gifted?
You kind of stand out, amongst all the other people.
You're exceptional.
Like these talk show people, like you're for the internet talk show stuff. You're up there. You're right up there. You strive to do well, and you do well. You won't allow people to come on and just slander.
I want to share a little. I want to share a little story with you because we're almost out of time. We're into this next commercial break here. I actually grew up completely unaware I had a high IQ. My parents knew it from school testing, but they never shared it with me. And I was literally in junior college when my counselor gave me an IQ test and said, oh, wow. And I joined Mensa for a while, but the reason I left Mensa was I kept running into people who thought they were owed something simply because they had a high IQ, but they really weren't doing anything with it. And that was a huge turnoff. And that's why I quit hanging out at Mensa. Anyway, listen, thank you for the phone call, Al. We got to take another break for commercials, and we will be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here, and we're going to take a break from all these people trying to prove that our show is anti-Semitic. And still, actually. And Alan West came out with this article. It's a former congressman. He's a very popular conservative, and he basically came out with his top 10 reasons to vote Democrat. And I think it's a good list here. Number 10 is I'll vote Democrat because I can't wait for college football season to be delayed or canceled because the student athletes are union employees. Number 9 is I'll vote Democrat because I believe oil companies' profits of 4% on a gallon of gas are obscene, but the government taxing that same gallon of gas at 15% isn't. Number 8, I'll vote Democrat because I believe the government will do a better job of spending the money I earn than I would. Number 7, I'll vote Democrat because freedom of speech is fine as long as nobody is offended by it. Number 6, I'll vote Democrat because I'm way too irresponsible to own a gun, and I know that my local police are all I need to protect me from murderers and thieves. I'm also thankful that we have a 911 service that could get police to your home in order to identify your body after a home invasion. Number 5, I'll vote Democrat because I'm not concerned about millions of babies being aborted so long as we keep all death row inmates alive and comfy. Number 4, I'll vote Democrat because I think illegal aliens have a right to free health care, education, and Social Security benefits, and we should take away the Social Security from those who paid into it. Number 3, I'll vote Democrat because I believe that businesses should not be allowed to make profits for themselves. They need to break even and give the rest away to the government for redistribution as the Democrats see fit. Number 2, I'll vote Democrat because I believe liberal judges need to rewrite the Constitution every few days to suit some fringe kooks who would never get their agendas past the voters. And the number 1 reason I'll vote Democrat is because I think that it's better to pay billions for oil to people who hate us, but not drill our own, because it might upset some endangered beetle, gopher, fish, or frog. And I think he definitely has laid out much of the agenda. You can't have freedom of speech and an offensive free society. It just will not work. And this hypersensitivity to being offended is being used to undermine our First Amendment rights. Over at NBC News, when Donald Trump went to Iraq, NBC actually published an article Christmas Day alleging Trump snubbed the troops. And of course, the story was completely incorrect, and NBC has backed down from it and admitted the thrust of the article is no longer correct. Well, it never was correct. It was fake news. But they left the article up there, but they did comment it saying the thrust of the article is no longer correct. Okay. All right. And again, getting back to everybody's already talking 2020. The latest poll is showing that Trump would beat O'Rourke, ties Sanders, but would lose to Biden. So that's where the numbers are. But again, we're looking at almost 2 years to the next election here. Now, Bernie Sanders, who has not yet said that he's going to run in 2020, is complaining, saying that establishment Democrats are already attacking him in the 2020 primary states. He issued a press release saying the Democratic establishment is running attack ads in early primary states to try and undermine his progressive agenda should he run in the 2020 presidential race. Now, I'm wondering why they're doing that, because supposedly the Democrats are liberals and they're progressives and socialists, and Bernie Sanders makes no secret of the fact he's a socialist. But again, apparently there's this group of Wall Street Democrats, they call themselves the Third Way, and saying that ideas like Medicare for all are a path to defeat in 2020. Now, I would actually agree with that. But again, and maybe it's because this is kind of my job to pay attention to all this stuff, but it does seem like that constant campaigning and election process has totally absorbed all of our politicians. They're no sooner out of one election than they're already campaigning for the next one. And I admire those countries that actually have laws saying that campaigns can only run for so many months before the election, because the rest of the time we want these politicians, in theory, trying to make this a better country. And I think one of the reasons there was such hostility toward Trump's Make America Great Again campaign was it forced politicians to acknowledge that we're not a great country. Not anymore. And that in turn, of course, reminds me of that wonderful HBO series, The Newsroom. And I do wish they would bring it back. And in the premiere episode, the anchor, Will McAvoy, is at a college with the question and answer sessions. And the question by one of the students is, what makes America the greatest nation on earth? And the two people sitting with him say, oh, because we've got freedom, and it's this and it's that. And Will McAvoy jokes about, football teams and things like that. And when he's really pressed on the point, he says, no, my answer is we're not the greatest nation on earth anymore. And he launches into this, this explanation of all the things that are going wrong with this country. And you can find this on YouTube. It's called The Most Honest 3 Minutes in Television or something along that. But it was, for me, it was the high point of the entire series. Now, earlier we were talking about Mumia al-Jamal regaining his rights to appeal his conviction, and the very real possibility that he could be released from jail because the original case against him was weak. Along the same lines, lawyers for convicted Boston Marathon bomber Dzhokhar Tsarnaev are out there saying they want the death sentence tossed. And their rationales because it was impossible for him to get a fair trial in the same city where the bomb exploded. So his lawyers filed a 500-page brief with the first U.S. District Court of Appeals. And Tsarnaev's legal team outlined a host of other problems with his 2015 trial. First and foremost, that the defense attorney he was assigned walked on in and said to the jury, yeah, he did it. What kind of a defense attorney is that? I imagine lawyers who are not so strongly connected to the deep state would be disbarred for doing that. The defense lawyer's job is to get them up. And we all know there is evidence that would create reasonable doubt in the mind of a jury. And in fact, I reposted it to the front of whatreallyhappened.com. So, I'd like to see Tsarnaev get a new trial. And I'd like to be able to get in touch with their lawyers with the evidence that we have. Show that to a jury. There's your reasonable doubt. All right, so let's talk about the economic news here coming up on the top of the hour and the lovely Lady Claire. We've been talking about the growing national debt and how out of control it is. Literally back in the 1990s, there was a state resolution that was going from state to state. It was called the Ultimatum Resolution, which said that when the national debt went over $6 trillion, the federal government would be dissolved. Unfortunately, not enough states voted for it to bring it into effect. But even back then, people were saying it was really crazy. And then, of course, you have the other side saying, oh, the debt doesn't matter as long as we've got liquidity. Well, the debt matters because the debt must be serviced. There is interest on that. And right now, we are coming up on the point where paying the interest on the national debt, and we're talking about the interest, not the principal, just the interest payments on the national debt will soon exceed national defense spending. And you know how much that is. So that is how bad the debt is. Now, the interesting thing is, if we had the original economic system of this country with no Federal Reserve, no private central bank, and we've been paying the principal without interest, just since Vietnam, the American people would have totally paid off the national debt. That debt is what enslaves us. That debt is what the privately owned Federal Reserve uses to control us. That's your slave chains right there here. U.S. debt has soared nearly $1.4 trillion from last Christmas. It's rising $44,000 per second. And we were talking the other day about how there had been some money spent during the Christmas holiday shopping binges, but it was not necessarily a good thing because all of it had been borrowed, saddling all those families with more debt at a time when the Federal Reserve is getting ready to keep on rising the prime rate. Now, as we mentioned earlier, at the top of our show, the deadline has come and gone for somebody to bid to take over Sears. And if no bid has come on in, and I haven't seen it reported yet one way or the other, then Sears will begin liquidation immediately. Meanwhile, over at the Gap, they're having to close their flagship store on Fifth Avenue in New York. Now, this being the end of the holiday shopping season, all of these retailers should have a certain amount of cash to work with, but apparently not over at the Gap here. Story coming out of Russia today. Remember the big fury over Bitcoin? Oh, that was going to be the future of money. And I do think cryptocurrencies can work. But the way Bitcoin was being handled always smelled funny to me. And experts are now saying Bitcoin turned out to be this year's worst investment. It has lost more than 80% of its value since last year's all-time high of $20,000. It's currently trading below $3,700. And they're predicting it's going to drop below $3,000 in the very near future. Now, getting on back to all those sanctions between Russia and the European Union, and, well, apparently they're not working all that well because Russia-EU trade turnover has surged by almost 22%. It's been steadily growing since the beginning of 2017. So good for them that they're keeping the commerce going, because that is the path to peace. You make things, you grow things, you sell them, you trade back and forth. That's how you have a peaceful world. Apparently, China's startup bubble is into trouble, and the hottest startups are all crumbling and wiping out investors. One of them was a bike share company, and that's been tried in this country. Didn't work out all that well. The idea was that there would be this stands of bicycles. In China, they're very big on bicycles, more so than America. But there would be these bike stands with all these bicycles, and you would come up to one of them, plunk your plastic in the lock, and then you would take the bicycle and you would ride it to where you were going, where you would find another bike stand into which you would insert the bicycle and leave it. And it sounds like a good idea, but I think a lot of people are concerned about the hygiene of such a system. And the Chinese are really big on hygiene and avoiding infection, and that may have been why they didn't do very well. Meanwhile, Donald Trump is considering an executive order to ban purchases of Huawei and ZTE equipment over the concern that they're a threat to national security, that they might contain spyware. This is happening less than 2 weeks before a U.S. delegation is heading to Beijing to talk about trade and sort out this whole Huawei mess. Now, I know one of the big issues for the U.S. government is that the Huawei cell phones use a form of encryption the NSA is not able to easily break. And the NSA definitely wants to be able to listen to everybody on planet Earth. All right, we're going to take a phone call. Charles in Toledo. Aloha, Charles. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about white genocide, Mike.
I'm sorry, would you repeat that?
I said I wanted to talk about white genocide and the neo-nationalist supremacist conspiracy theory.
Okay, but make it fast. We're coming up on a commercial break.
No, I'm saying if can you hold me over to the break?
No, because the Lady Claire is coming on the show, and I've got more news I got to cover. You got about 25 seconds.
You ever heard about David Lane?
I think I've heard the name, but it may not be the same David Lane you're talking about.
No, I said David Lane.
Lane, no.
Oh, it was coined by a high-profile
white nationalist Robert Whitaker, and commonly associated with the topic of white genocide. Have you ever heard of white genocide?
I've heard it being discussed by a lot of people. Charles, I'm going to have to let you go. We got to take a break for commercials, and we will be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. And we're talking about the economic news here. And there's been a new development in the tariff wars. As of the 30th of this month, Tokyo will begin reducing tariffs and easing quotas on products sold by the United States' largest agricultural competitors, including Australia, Canada, Chile, and New Zealand, as part of the new 11-member Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, Trump had removed the U.S. from the TPP last year, alleging it would have crippled American manufacturers by minimizing duties on U.S. imports of automobiles. Well, this is going to really slam American farmers they're losing their markets in Japan. And it's going to be a question of where are they going to sell their products to. Between the high tariffs and the GMO issue, it looks like our agricultural sector is going to take a major hit in the coming year. Now, we talk a lot about gold and silver and having at least part of your portfolio in metals and have it under your own control here. And again, a little piece of advice, the gold coins lose their value if you eat that chocolate part out of the middle, so don't do that. But there is a new metal out there which is really taking off, and it's vanadium. And not a lot of people know about it. It's used in small amounts that strengthen steel significantly. You've probably heard of chrome vanadium steel. It's in high demand following new Chinese regulations on infrastructure and buildings. So the market for the metal is still very small, but it's definitely growing. And the supply of vanadium globally has been drawn down to nearly nothing. So it is definitely taking off for those who can acquire it and hang on to it for a bit. Now, here is an article. This came out of Investment Watch blog, and it asks, could the $38 billion given to Israel by the United States be used to feed, clothe, and shelter America's 500,000 homeless? Actually, I think there's more than 500,000, but we'll start with that. And getting out the old Hewlett-Packard calculator and running through the calculations, basically that comes to $76,000 per homeless person. That's enough to get them off the streets, get them into a rental property, probably buy a car. And it just shows that our government's priorities are not pointed at the American people. Down in Florida, a guy named Rigo Torres has set up a GoFundMe page called Support Tunnels Under Trump's Wall. And he's trying to raise money to buy shovels to dig tunnels underneath the border wall. So far, it's only collected $3,000 from just 256 people. Okay, there's the music. It's time for station identification, and we'll be back with hour number 3 and the lovely Lady Claire. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show, hour number 3. And for those of you watching on YouTube, this gorgeous creature sitting next to me is the lovely Lady Claire, who joins us on Friday, hour number 3, and of course, especially for the last live show of 2018. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, RBN is giving the much overworked staff a holiday Monday and Tuesday. So our next live show will be Wednesday, January 2nd, 2019. Before we get into Claire's stuff, though, we do have a caller waiting on the line. Errol in the Netherlands, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hello, Mike, and hello, Claire.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you for taking my call. I wrote something down, and maybe this is for a future movie. That maybe it's going to release at science fiction. Can I read it?
Real quick.
Okay, real quick. What if the Earth is like a seeded egg inside a woman's womb, and that the sun is the lamp that will eventually fade and let go. I wish you a very happy 2000 and healthy 2019 and support RBN. Thank you for taking my call, Mike. And Claire,
yes,
keep it up. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you very much, and Happy New Year to you as well. All righty. And before we get into the individual news items, though, this being our last live show of the year here, I think it's worth looking back. And by the way, you're welcome to call in with your look back. What was important to you in 2018? What do you think will happen in 2019? What your New Year's resolutions are? And of course, I resolved not to make stupid resolutions I have no intention of keeping. But this last year, it was a very, very rough one, starting first and foremost with your back injury in January, which you are still recovering from.
Yes, I know.
Then we had the Honda stolen twice. Last time it was stripped, and fortunately, we had already been saving for a newer car. We were able to get a replacement. You had a couple of bad falls that we had to deal with. And I don't know, I think there's a curse on your church, because we have lost so many people there, including two of the singers in Claire's choir died of cancer that just came out of nowhere and just like lightning took these people out. And a lot of non-choir people suffered major illnesses. Saturday we have to go visit one who just succumbed to a stroke, which I don't think he's going to recover from. There have been a lot of good things, but I think on a whole, 2018 was a real armpit of a year. You know, what can I tell you?
But Mike, the way I look at it, and I've shared this with our pastor, in terms of health challenges, I am 100% pre-disastered. So I think 2019, if it's even moderately better than 2018, all will be well.
Well, I'm hoping the same here because, you know, my worry was that it was the start of a trend because we are OLDER.
Oh, yes.
And we're at the age where things start to wear out and break. So anyway, so let's get into the news here.
Okay. This is about the 2020 election. Harris, Booker, and Warren to announce their candidacies next month. And this is being done because of the enormous amount of money it takes to be elected. And corporations one has to impress. And one of the things that frustrates me greatly about the Democratic Party, and believe it or not, I have called Tom Perez's office about this. I think, Tom, you need to look at a candidate who can get elected, and that would be our state representative, Tulsi Gabbard.
Well, she's thrown her hat in the ring. She's already visiting the early primary states here, but I don't think she'll be vetted by the deep state because she's very much anti-war. She went to Syria on her own trying to find a way to settle that mess down. So
and I one thing I've got to say, I respect her intelligence and her integrity. And the other three, I don't know if they would actually be able to carry the Democratic Party in 2020. Tulsi Gabbard can. She's young. She is very ecumenical. She grew up in a family that was believing in a number of different faiths, but no one hit anyone over the head because of it. Well, you know, and the one thing I'm thinking right now, looking at the trajectory of U.S. foreign and domestic policy, I will bet you a Turkish piastre that whoever shows themselves to be a person who wants to resolve the United States geopolitical issues with something other than war is going to be the favored candidate, because I think by 2020...
Well, they may be the favorite candidate with the people, and that was certainly a big part of Trump's popularity in 2016. But at least up until recently, Trump, I think, demonstrated that once somebody gets into that Oval Office...
they get turned.
They get turned or they get controlled here. All right. I'd like to do a quick shout out to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining our network. And we have a caller on the line, Tom in Florida. Aloha, Tom. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yeah, good day, Michael. What's on my mind is, first of all, what's going on with the wall. Schumer I found out that the wall in Israel is 28 foot on average height, and Schumer was us taxpayers in the United States funded, like, I believe it was close to $3 billion for their wall.
Ouch.
And Israel, the American taxpayers. But here, this guy Schumer doesn't want to even give Trump $1 billion to build the wall. It's disgusting. And what's going on is I was reading the Jane's Defense book about 6 months ago, Michael, and I believe that the United States gives Israel, what, $16 billion, is it? I found out it's $16 billion.
Yeah, there's a total of $38 billion. It's being paid over 10 years that we know of, but there are other ways that Congress sends money to Israel that we're not supposed to look at. I mean, they'll loan money to Israel and then forgive the loan so Israel doesn't have to pay it back.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah, Michael, and also as far as France goes with Marcon, this guy Marcon, it's not about the gas tax is one thing, but it's about all the Muslims in France. All those people demanding cars, and when in their countries in the Middle East, most of them won't even have cars. But they want to. In France, you basically need a car to get around, according to my buddy, because it's just like the United States. You need to have transportation to get around. So the point is, they keep bringing all these people, even here in the United States. These people never had cars in Central America. They're going to come here. They're going to be demanding cars. They're going to be demanding, hot showers. They don't have that in their countries. I was in Cuba, and I can tell you, they don't know what a hot shower is. Half of them, 90% of them. They don't want. The toilet paper is very scarce over in those islands, and I mean, look, what's going on here is unbelievable. This is, and I think it was on your show that some guy said that the United States can only sustain 190 million people in the United States. Otherwise, it's an ecological disaster.
Well, we already have 300 million here, but yeah, the more of these illegal immigrants and refugees come on in here, it is putting a huge strain on an already fragile economy, and it is causing all kinds of social problems. And I'm glad that Trump is finally standing up to the Democrats, and he's at the point right now saying that if they refuse to budge on funding for the border wall, he's just going to close the border completely. And cut off foreign aid to some of these Central American countries, which, as you know, was a big stink because we're sending more money down to Central America and Mexico for security than the wall itself would cost. And looking at the numbers even deeper than that, if we had that wall, if we stopped the illegal immigration, the money that would be saved from having to take care of all these people would actually be more than the cost of the wall itself. But the Democrats want the open borders. The globalists want the open borders. The Democrats are counting on the illegal immigrant vote to hand them control of the government in 2020.
Absolutely, Michael. You're hit it right on the head. Mm-hmm. And, Michael, as far as the language goes, how is it that Spanish can come here and it can keep like 20 radio stations on AM and you only have 3 on AM in English, and no other group, the Germans don't have 20 radio stations in German, the Italians, the Polish, the Danes, the Norwegians. None of these people that came here have all these radio stations and TV stations, but these people have Telemundo, they have all these in our country. Now, can you imagine the Germans are the biggest population in this country, the United States? Could you imagine if 98 million Germans all of a sudden say we want to speak German and we want to have German TV stations and radio stations? They wouldn't allow it. But what's going on with that? How can that be allowed?
Well, it's not being allowed. It is simply the refusal. It's the refusal of the immigrants to assimilate.
Yeah.
And their attitude is, you should speak Spanish to us because that's our language. And I was even seeing this all the way back when we lived in Southern California, where the Hispanic community was out there demanding bilingual traffic signs and bilingual signs in the stores. They wanted separate sections in the school. They wanted to remain Hispanic rather than become American.
Mexifornia, Michael. It's Mexifornia. It's Mexifornia. Yeah. Michael, when I was in Costa Mesa, California in 1982, it was a beautiful place. My brother lived out there, and he was doing the block trade. He was laying block and glass block and brick and all that. He did the whole thing, fireplaces. When he left there in 2005, I thought I was in Mexico. I honestly, and all the Americans that were doing block and brick and all the trades, they all got wiped out. This was by design. Believe me, California was the state of Nixon and Reagan.
Yes.
Look at it now. And you got that clown Brown saying, well, you know what, you Democrats are going too far left now. Unbelievable. It's crazy.
It really is out of control. But if you look across this country, every place that has been under Democratic control for years and years, they're in serious trouble because
Ruination, Michael.
Yeah. You look at Baltimore. You look at Chicago. It's a mess. It's just
Detroit?
a pure mess.
Yeah. No, we are an empire in decline. We're an empire in decline.
Yes, sir. Well, Happy New Year, Michael. God bless you all. And you and your host, Happy New Year. You have a great New Year.
All right, thanks an awful lot. Thanks an awful lot. And Happy New Year to you, John. Okay, so getting on back to the news here.
I love this. Cohen-Prague claim crumbles as McClatchy reporter admits to third-hand information. And apparently there was an interview yesterday with McClatchy's Greg Gordon, and he revealed that he and his colleague, Peter Stone, oh my, had actually not seen the underlying evidence that a phone call allegedly traced to Cohen briefly sent signals ricocheting off cell towers in the Prague area in late summer 2016, a report which echoed their April claim that special counsel Robert Mueller had evidence of Cohen's trip. Not. Which, according to the controversial, completely discredited Steele dossier, was to meet with Kremlin leaders inside to make arrangements to pay Russian hackers.
Well, this is a major embarrassment, and of course, the reason that this all came up is Cohen's passport showed that he never went there, and so somebody came up with this thing. Well, we got his cell phone. His cell phone was pinging towers, and we don't know why it's not on his passport, but there's the proof. Well, second of all, you can spoof a cell phone. If you know what you're doing, you can make your phone look like somebody else's. But setting that aside, clearly this was all made up. They're trying to bolster this case. I get a sense of panic coming from Mueller.
Desperation on the cusp of madness.
Absolutely here.
I'd like to pop on over now to Zero Hedge, and if you folks haven't looked at it yet, treat yourself. Do yourself a favor. We don't always agree. We're not always seeing eye to eye. But Tyler Durden, who is the primary webmaster, does, for me, a pretty creditable job most of the time. Now, he was carrying an article about Pat Buchanan, 2020, year of the Democrats? Maybe not. And he talked a lot about this whole thing of identity politics, which has to do with race, ethnicity, and a complete, utter sense of being offended at anything, you know. And I kind of had to make the observation that identity politics can work for a while, but because of its nature as being so fractious, and it can tear people apart, and it can tear a party apart into pieces for the long term. Mike, what do you think?
I absolutely agree. And these various stunts that are pulled, they work short term until people realize how they're being played. And hopefully sometime between now and the 2020 elections, we're going to have people waking up and realizing what utter nonsense all this transgender stuff was, and how different racial groups were being suckered into hating each other.
They were being set up.
They were being set up. They were being manipulated. That all of these groups that were fanning the flames of racism, like Black Lives Matter, they were bought and paid for by political activists to keep people stirred up. To play that identity politics. And of course, Hillary played identity politics in 2016 because the Democrats don't really have any ideas.
They didn't have a platform.
They didn't have a platform. And what they have been doing in these various cities, like we were saying, Baltimore, is clearly not working. And people are looking around and saying, yeah, the Democrats are really good at, rabble rousing, getting people to, get angry and offended. But the quality of life is still going down. The jobs are going away. And this very Democrat-supported open borders policy is impacting our economy. It's impacting the job market. It's causing all kinds of crime. Not to mention contagious diseases being reintroduced.
Oh, yeah. I mean, diseases we have not seen in the United States for decades.
And so hopefully between now and 2020, Americans are going to wake up and realize that the Democrats are so totally obsessed with just maintaining their power, their grip on power. They're not really doing anything positive for the nation and its people.
And the optics are pretty lousy, and I'm going to go into this at a little bit more depth. Apparently, Nancy Pelosi is spending the shutdown at a Hawaii resort praying for rain. I mean, not really. Maxine Waters is in the Bahamas. Now, contrast this. President Trump canceled his Florida trip to try to get something done and try to get a rapprochement with the Democrats. And it seems to me like Pelosi and Waters have just run away from their constituencies, who probably have some very hard questions regarding the border wall issue and the costs of illegal immigration. Now, this is why, while President Trump cancels his trip to Florida in order to break the stalemate, I think that was very noble of him. And these ladies, I mean, many of them have people who are first or second generation Americans. Many of them have worked very hard, but they know that if there is this flood of more illegals, that if they are doing something, they're going to be getting undercut, in terms of performing jobs.
They absolutely are. Yeah. And, it's kind of interesting to note that the legal immigrants are getting tired of all this as well, because they're tired of being conflated with the illegals. And it's causing them all kinds of problems. Now, Congress is adjourned until next Thursday. Next Wednesday. And no, it is next Thursday. And so I can understand that Pelosi and Waters might want to skedaddle out of town. They don't want to listen to any questions about the wall. They have decided they're going to fight this thing tooth and nail, because without the flood of illegal immigrants, their election prospects in 2020
are grim.
Begin to erode.
They do. They do.
So Donald Trump, of course, has tried to come up with some compromise plans. Pelosi dissed him, saying that Trump's latest officer was a beaded curtain. So Trump shouldn't try and compromise, okay? Because they're just going to throw it back in his face. Maxine Waters and Nancy Pelosi don't want to compromise. They want what they want when they want it. We got to take another break for commercials. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. And let's do a few more news stories. And then I want to sort of talk about what we're likely to see in 2019.
Fine. I think that would be great. I read today that Wells Fargo has had a very, very good week. Now, you may not realize it when I tell you what the good week was, but from a standpoint of their executive offices, this was heaven on a bun. Wells Fargo agrees to pay $575 million to resolve state investigations of their business practices in all 50 states. Guys, let me get my head around this, please. What this is tantamount to a bribe by Wells Fargo to all 50 states' district attorneys to close their investigation on Wells Fargo's potentially illegal actions.
This is to the attorney generals.
Attorneys general, and create their own bank-hired teams to review and respond to customers' complaints about its banking and sales practices. Mike, the thing that is wrong with this picture is everything, because no one who signed off on initiating these practices goes to jail, and the bank can continue business as usual.
And of course, Wells Fargo will simply take a large chunk of that $500 million off of their taxes, shifting the economic burden back onto the people. and they'll make up the rest of it by increasing fees on their customers.
Yeah.
So I'm wearing an appropriate T-shirt today that one of our listeners sent in. You know, that Jesse James was right. The bankers are the real outlaws.
Yeah. And why anyone would continue to bank with an institution like this, the name of which should be Wells Gangsta Fargo, is a complete and utter mystery to me. I don't know why they do it.
Okay, we got a caller on the line here, so we're going to go to Mark in Georgia. Aloha, Mark. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
I think it was entirely appropriate you're contending with that guy who, when you said he's broad brushing, and he said, "No, you're saying white one." No, he's making a generalized accusation, just like people make generalized accusations against Muslims, and like they always ignore context. But the thing is, the problem is not Jews. The problem are people that feign to have a moral standard. And, Ezekiel 18 makes very clear the man who, verse 20 in particular, the man who sins is the one who dies. A father's not going to be held accountable for his son's sins, or his son's not going to suffer for his own sins. The sins of the father will be visited on the son, but that doesn't mean that they'll, but the thing is that we're all going to be accountable for our own actions. And to make an indiscriminate statement that Jews in general are the problem is completely missing the fact that Aaron Russo was a very morally sound Jew who warned us about this phony named Nick Rockefeller, warned him, and if you listen to that warning, it sounds a lot like Revelation 13. He didn't cite that passage, but actually I saw the earlier version of America Freedom Dispatch. It did not contain the reference to Revelation 13, but the later version that wound up getting released did.
Yes.
And so, that's the thing is that our quarrel is not with Jews, and I agree with the King of the Jews regarding Revelation 2:9 and 3:9, and what Christ himself says, they call themselves Jews but are not. And if they were legitimately Jewish, if they really did have a moral standard, that is what I mean by that, then we wouldn't be at odds with them. The problem is these people believe and behave that they're above the law. I mean that criminal element, because they unlawfully control the issuance of currency and a lot of other things that are just plain immoral. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and that really is the issue. There are good people and there are bad people, and good people do good things, bad people do bad things. Both will often use religion as their excuse, but there are a lot of Jewish people who are, in fact, very moral. Aaron Russo was one, Rene Valente was another, which is why the rule on this show is we do not paint with a broad brush. We talk about individuals.
And let's also talk about your friend in Israel, the man of peace.
Steve Amsel.
God bless him.
Steve
He's a
Amsel
wonderful
over
soul.
at Desert Peace is another good one.
Yeah.
And Gilad Atzmon, obviously, a very moral person, very courageous person as well.
And a friend of mine is a Palestinian Christian, and I try to explain to people, well, Arabs are Semitic, and I believe you are too, because you're of Sephardic lineage.
Yes.
To me, that's either here or there, because I don't believe that lineage. I mean, you can have a heritage that you can either live up to or try to live down, depending on how you see things. But the thing is that the thing I try to be clear, I agree with Jews of good conscience who are slandered as so-called self-hating Jews because they criticize the actions of the Israeli government, and when you obstruct needful corrective measures, it only makes a bad situation worse, because impunity brings out the worst in people. And that's the problem that all the countries have with so-called Israel, is that it behaves in a lawless manner. And I guess I get you got a mailing address on your What Really Happened website where I can send you a Christmas card?
Christmas is now over. There's a mailing address, under the donate button. But Mark, I'm sorry, Mark, I'm sorry to cut you off. We got to take a break for commercials, and we'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. And Claire, what is your next story?
The next story is very serious and came from globalresearch.ca. It's a Canadian blog that has a lot of responsible writers in it. And this was written by Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, for whom I have tremendous respect, and Stephen Cohen. And the title of the article is "The Self-Genocide of the West, preparing its population for war. And what they're saying is that the Democrats seem to have a real interest in the vilification of Russia because Russiagate kind of explained Hillary's loss in the 2016 presidential election. And they give Democrats hope for removing Trump from office. And unfortunately, the media is not going to tell us what is really happening out there. And here's an article that tells me that we are very close to being at war with Russia and kind of validating what these gentlemen are talking about. Now, this article comes from the BBC. And BBC, I'm listening. I'm watching. If you keep telling lies like this, you're going to hear about it.
Well, remember, BBC is the network that announced the collapse of World Trade Center Building 7 26 minutes before it happened.
All right. Now, I'm quoting this. A couple things have to be quoted. Russian forces annexed Ukraine's Crimea Peninsula in March 2014, a move condemned internationally. Crimea has a Russian-speaking majority. And
now, of course, that's not what happened.
No, and I'm going to get into that.
Okay.
Yeah, BBC has sort of sunk from delivering excellence in journalism to consistently belching its putrid, foul codswallop on the minds of its readers, constantly capitulating to the British and U.S. government's war-centric agenda over the truth. And they believe they're suffering from magical thinking. They believe that this will absolutely be received by their readers as gospel, solid fact. But I would have to politely suggest to the management of BBC that may have been a point in the past, but it's not the case at this point in the 21st century. And there are a couple of reasons why. First is that U.S. and U.K. citizens are both war-weary, war-skeptical, and looking to independent resources to actually get the news. And, well, BBC, you're going to get it. Peacefully, quietly, but you're going to get it. You lie when you use the word annexed in reference to Crimea. This never happened. And please note on this article, not even the night janitor wanted to put their names to this ridiculous story. And in light of the fact that whoever cobbled this together has a very severe case of something we talk about all the time on this show, SMD, selective memory disorder. I'm going to be very happy once again to break this down in small words that even they
take
can
notes.
understand.
There'll be a quiz next class.
Okay, let's set the Wayback Machine to 2014. This was the spring that we saw Yanukovych, the legitimately elected president of Ukraine, get thrown under the proverbial bus, and Poroshenko was anointed to replace him, as he was thought to be more pro-Western than was Yanukovych. This election was more crooked than a dog's hind leg, with massive vote fraud going on. Now, there are a couple of articles I would like to point to.
Now, you're talking about Poroshenko's re-election.
Yes, Poroshenko. Well, no, I'm talking about the first time, talking about history and how it relates to now. Apparently, there was a Facebook post that the U.S. spent $5 billion on regime change in Ukraine. I'm sorry, when we have one homeless vet sleeping in our streets while our infrastructure is crumbling. This was absolutely an obscene spending of money. And in fact, no less an American icon than President Obama himself did confess that the U.S. had brokered a deal to effect regime change in Ukraine. I've got it documented, a couple of articles on that. And as the BBC article writer should know, I've got documentation on my side. You have absolutely nothing, game over. Now, the Crimeans knew after this putsch that there was no legitimate representation in Kiev. So here's precisely what they did. And Mike, please feel free to jump in if I'm wrong. I don't think I'm wrong on these facts. Number one, they held a free, fair, and transparent referendum after the putsch. Do we want to stay with Ukraine or should we petition the Russian Federation to join? And so they were asked, and then the Crimean people requested to become a part of the Russian Federation, and the Russian Federation accepted that. There was no annexation, folks. The A word did not appear anywhere in that.
I remember when that first, because it was actually two referendums.
Yeah.
The first one was to secede from Ukraine.
Yes.
And when they announced the second referendum to merge with Russia, I remember there was all this propaganda all over the TV that Russia was invading Crimea, that there were tanks crossing the border, there were warplanes all over the place. All of it, of course, junk.
Idiocy,
And that's not what happened. Now, the U.S. is taking the position that they do not recognize the right of the Crimean people to vote themselves independent.
Self-determination.
Self-determination, even though that is part of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to which the United States is obligated by being a member of the United Nations.
And so is the UK.
And so is the UK.
And
so the attitude was, we don't recognize your right to do that. And they're thinking, I've mentioned this before, it's kind of on the level of a guest at a wedding saying that the bride doesn't have a right to choose that groom. Therefore, by default, the groom has kidnapped and raped the bride. Because the default position, if you don't recognize the right of Crimea to determine its own future, and they're now part of the Russian Republic, then Russia must have somehow stolen it. And of course, that is the propaganda that we get from the corporate media all the time. Russia annexed Crimea. Did not happen that way. It is a big, big, big lie.
Absolutely. And we all know that demonization of a country for what it absolutely did not do, and supporting that demonization through sanctions, again, for what it absolutely did not do, are generally a prelude to a shooting war. And Mike, I've got to tell you, as you just mentioned, the US and UK are signatories to the UN Charter, which enshrines the concept of peaceful self-determination. And so, BBC, if you think you can go on lying to demonize Russia with no repercussions, I politely beg to differ. And I would strongly suggest that those still reading this rag, cloaked in its antique, tattered reputation for truth-telling, will be fact-checking in other places and will start to ignore BBC and what they say completely. You brought it on yourself, BBC.
Absolutely. Okay, we're going to take a couple of phone calls here. And then we're going to talk about the coming year. We're going to start with Lenny in California. Aloha, Lenny. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yes. First off, as far as the BBC is concerned, they take their talking orders from the Tavistock Institute, which is in the business of programming the nature out of people and programming what they want to into people. There used to be when a lie was called a lie. Okay, now it's called misspoke, or I misdid, or they give you these talking points, and then the human beings, being the functional or the fallenaries that they are, have a tendency just to follow along. Okay, but let me get back to what I call for, and that was about generalization. I remember when I was a student in college, and I had a professor who had assigned us an assignment, and he seemed surprised that I made an A on the assignment. So after class, he stopped me and he said, "I would like to talk with you." And he said, "Well, I have a question for you. Why can't the rest of them be like you?" And I thought to myself, here's a so-called professor in a collegiate university who's in the charge of young people's minds, yet he's using a generalization to get me, a specific person, to answer his generalized question. And I thought to myself, well, what the hell are you going to think of me if I even try and answer that? So I gave him a look to tell him, you should stop in your questioning at this point. Now, Mike, to prove my point, I remember I saw a movie years later. It was called Deep Cover, starring Lawrence Fishburne and Jeff Goldblum.
Yes.
And they were hiring this so-called black cop, and they asked Lawrence Fishburne in the interview, what's the difference between a black man and a so-called nigger? And Lawrence Fishburne looked at the white interviewer and said, a nigger is the one who would even bother trying to answer a stupid question like that.
That was a good line. That was a good line. I want to go back to your college professor. I want to go back to your college professor. His generalization was wrong. And it does show a previous prejudice, but at the same time, I think he intended the question as a compliment. So, let's cut a little bit of slack there. Anyway, Lenny, we're getting short on...
Real quick. I got to tell you something real quick, though.
Real quick.
First off, Yanukovych is not pronounced Yanukovych, it's Yanukovych. And second, I got to hit you on one of your trivia questions. You've been saying that Clint Eastwood only movie that he sang the song in was Paint Your Wagon. It wasn't. It was Honky Tonk Man. It's the last movie he sang the song in. Check it out.
All right, I'll check it out there.
Thanks.
I'll check it out. All right, Lenny, we're going to let you go and switch back over to Dustin in New Jersey. And Dustin, what's on your mind?
Wasn't Lee Marvin in Paint Your Wagon also?
It's been so long since I've seen that movie. I really don't know. I'm sure it's going to come around on Turner Classic Movies at some point. And in fact, some of the films I worked on early in my career are now on Turner Classic Movies, and boy, does that make me feel old.
I hear you.
Oh, man.
I hear you, my dear.
Man.
Better than all the other crap that's on TV. Turner Classic Movies are great shows on there.
Yeah, they
I wanted to wish you, Mike.
Say again?
I wanted to wish you guys a happy New Year.
And back to you.
What are your predictions?
That's what I'm going to say. It's not good, Mike.
Yeah.
I think there's going to be more turmoil in the stock market because they injected all this money, these corporations, the last couple of days, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Trying to prop it up, taking it from the bond market. I see turmoil there, and I see more dirty tricks against Russia, Mike. I see the British, the French, and the U.S. especially, like egging them on. I just see more of the same. I don't see any good outlook. What do you think?
Well, sadly, unfortunately, I agree with you. The national economy at this point is unrecoverable. It is just hopelessly mired in unpayable debt. And the government is running out of ways to squeeze more money out of the population, especially since the population is having to work for lower wages and salaries. So you can tell there's a crossover point that's coming where that's going to break apart. And I think it's going to be early in the next year. And as far as the wars are concerned, I know that the military-industrial complex, what they want is a new Cold War, where they can produce whatever junk weapons they produce for huge amounts of money, knowing they're never actually going to get used. But in the current political climate, the leap from a Cold War to a hot war is going to be very brief. All it takes is one hothead, and as I've mentioned before, the new dimension in this war is how many of our weapon systems are now automated, some of them autonomously, and all it's going to take is one bad piece of software to launch an attack on somebody. And as I've mentioned before, it was bad software that led the USS Vincennes to shoot down that Iranian passenger jet. Was bad software that resulted in the accidental shoot down of TWA 800. So we know these problems are out there. We know that these weapon systems are being deployed before they're even fully ready. They're already doing it with the F-35. It's still missing systems that will not be available for years, and yet they're already in use in places all over the world. And it's an ugly situation. And then you have wild card leaders like Erdogan, who could just launch a war. Right now, all of the ISIS who got kicked out of Syria, they're now up in Ukraine, getting onto the conflict line, if you will, with Lugansk and Donetsk. And so that's another potential flare-up point, because the ISIS fighters aren't really under any kind of a unified military command. So they could just start shooting at somebody.
And they've made no bones about being members of various jihadi organizations.
And talking about, we want to kill Russians because we love to kill Russians and we will always kill Russians.
Well, they're from Chechnya.
Yeah, well, I can understand there's a certain, well, some of them are, and I can understand there's a certain amount of hostility there.
And resentment.
Yes.
Yeah.
And real quick, Mike, also China, because we're unraveling because Chuck Schumer's even mentioned in China and the Democrats, so they know China's an economic enemy, and so is Russia, the whole Eurasia. So I see that in 2019. It's not good. But
well,
I
see the problem as not being one of Russia and China being economic competitors or enemies, as much as our government has self-destructed our economy. We've lost our manufacturing over the last 30 years. It's going to take at least 30 years to get that back. Our agriculture is in decline, and part of the problem is the breakdown of the irrigation systems out west. Another part of the problem, of course, is that disastrous experiment with GMO, and nobody wants that. Right now, somebody actually did a study on the American population. 98% of the people walking around show traces of glyphosate in their bodies. It is ubiquitous. You cannot get away from it. And it is a probable carcinogen, which I'm sure for the cancer industrial complex, they're going to be happy. Yee-haw, more patients, more money. But the reality is the bottom of any economy are the working people, because it is their labor that generates the wealth to power the rest of the system. And if the working class don't have jobs that pay them enough to do more than just eat and live, then the whole economy is going to come on down. We're seeing it already. Sears is about to go bye-bye, along with other stores. Anyway, Dustin, got to let you go. Got our last commercial break here, and we'll be back with the last segment of our program after these few words. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. Last segment of our last live show of 2018, and that's my lead-in to ask Claire, what do you think 2019 is going to be like?
I'm very concerned, as you know, about the trajectory of U.S. domestic and foreign policy. I think that in terms of the deep state, the Pentagon, and the White House, their brains are creating, or rather writing checks for a military that the military cannot cash.
There's been some pushback from the Pentagon on that, saying we're overextended, we don't have...
way much.
Yeah, and that may be another reason that Trump pulled out of Syria.
Could be, or to reposition the troops. History will sort of sort that out.
Yes.
But I'm deeply concerned about the belligerence of the United States right now around the world, and its concept that it cannot get what it wants geopolitically without a war, and
they want to drag the world back to Bretton Woods. I mean, we don't manufacture anything anybody wants to buy. Even, our defense industries are starting to lose sales to weapons companies in other countries, like again, Russia and China. China is now selling their hypersonic anti-ship missile. And again, I remember a time when American agriculture was the best in the world. We were called the breadbasket to the world.
Yes.
I remember the time when Russia, following that disaster with Lysenkoism, actually had to buy wheat from the United States. That was a huge embarrassment for the Soviet Union. So, but we've lost that. We don't produce as much food. In fact, the United States is now a net importer of food. And along with that GMO disaster, we can't find people outside the country to buy our produce. It's been one disastrous policy decision after the other, after the other, after the other. And there is unfortunately no way to just wind it all back and hit a reset button to take us back to somewhere in the 1970s when it all began to go wrong. So we are an empire in decline, and 2019 could very well be the year when the United States federal government suffers a Soviet Union-style collapse, which I think would be the best thing that could happen for the American people, could be the best thing that could happen for all these countries we're currently waging war on right now.
Or about to. Can I share something with you?
Yeah, real quick.
Okay. We have some net friends we've never met, and they send us some stories in English that they think need some attention that are not getting attention. But early this week, I got the sweetest video, and it was for a Russian Police Association choir.
Yes.
They were singing
I know how you feel about choirs.
English.
Yeah.
And just, you know, you had to smile when you listened to this. And singing in better English, by the way, than some of the people I talked to in my marketing missions. Yes. And they were singing beautifully, and it suddenly dawned on me, these kids, and they wouldn't like themselves to be thought of as kids, but I turned 70 next year, so I can. But these kids and I have no beef. I have no enmity toward any of them. If anything, I'd love to get them to sing some of my music.
Well, you know, English is a very common language in Russia and all over Europe. And we have a lot of Russian readers.
Yeah.
I know. Who send in contributions. Yeah. Okay, there's the music. We're going to get on out of here and start our well-deserved vacation here.
Yes.
So stay tuned for John Stedmiller. I'm sure he's got lots of things to share with you. Please share what you learn here with your friends. Please donate. Have a safe and sane holiday weekend, and we'll see you live back here on Wednesday, January 2nd, 2019. Aloha, America.